devoting my remarks today to Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah begins tomorrow evening. Yom HaShoah is always observed on the 27th day of Nisan, tomorrow evening and Monday, Yom HaShoah. On the 8th day of Pesach, just a few days ago, I offered some remarks before Yizkor, during which I referred to the incidents of all the campus demonstrations and protests. I used the word plague. Now, let me tell you why I use the word plague. I use the word plague because a plague is infectious. It is a disease, it is toxic, and it is harmful. Now, I have nothing against, and I would guess I'm speaking for most, if not everybody here, I have nothing against peaceful demonstrations, the ability of our country's citizens to exercise the right of freedom of speech, even when such speech disagrees with our positions and our opinions. It's a free country, right? And if people want to demonstrate and protest, they ought to have the right to do so. And yet the difference, one of the big differences between the freedom of speech and protests and demonstrations of the 60s and early 70s, when I was coming up, and some of us here were coming up, the civil rights protests, the anti-Vietnam War protests. The difference is that with these protests, one of the reasons I consider them a plague that is infectious and spreads so rapidly is because of the themes and slogans and messages that have been proliferating throughout these protests. Granted, there are some among the protests who are raising their voices against the Israeli military operations in Gaza and the suffering of Gazan citizens and civilians. And again, the case could be made legitimately, whether or not we agree with it. The case could be made again that we empathize, and I believe we ought to empathize with the suffering of anyone who would be considered to be innocent civilians. And so people protest that, they have the right to do so. That's not what bothers me so much. What bothers me are the slogans like "Free Palestine from the river to the sea." What does free Palestine mean? Free Palestine means get rid of Israel. What does it mean to say that Zionists have no place here? What does that mean, a slogan like that? Zionists have no place here. Where? Does it mean in the Middle East? Does it mean here? Does it mean both? Now, again, whoever is yelling slogans like that, I don't know what they're thinking, but when I'm listening to a slogan like that, I take it personally. What that slogan means to me is a message of anti-Semitism. I may be Zionist and I have no place here. So where should I go? So some of them have been saying, where should Zionists go? Back to Europe. I'm going to go back to Europe. And especially with Yom HaShoah on the horizon, tell that to a survivor or a second generation or even a third generation of survivor families. Tell them, go back to Germany, go back to Poland. You've got to be kidding me. Really? Some of these slogans are just absolutely mind-blowing in their venom. Free occupation, free occupied Palestine. What are they talking about when they're referring to occupied Palestine? Are they talking only about Gaza? Are they talking only about the West Bank? Well, again, maybe some are, I don't know, but I don't see into their minds and their hearts, but when I hear a slogan like that, I take it personally. Because to me, what that slogan is saying is, Israel has no right to exist. Free Palestine of Israel equals free Palestine of Jews, except for maybe Jewish Voices for Peace. They members of the JVP, maybe they want to settle Palestine, right? But the rest of us, Zionists, have no place here. So I think what is going on here is a collective and intentional amnesia. You know, it's kind of like a morph or modern or a twist, a perverse twist on a cancel culture kind of mentality. How soon people forget. How soon people forget. How soon after October 7th did people forget? But at these demonstrations, how often do you hear statements and slogans against the terrorism and evil of Hamas and the murderous slaughter of all the Israelis and the rape and the decapitation and the violence? How often do you hear that? There is a collective amnesia going on, canceling out what happened on October 7th, canceling out the long history of Israel's attempts to negotiate with Palestinians to create a Palestinian state when on the very verge of an agreement, Arafat and his cohorts pull out. Israel tried. They refuse. How soon we forget. 1947, partition, ratified by the United Nations, rejected by the Arabs. How soon do we forget? How soon do we forget the murder of 6 million and the creation of the state of Israel as a haven for all Jews who could come and live in safety and security as a refuge against anti-Semitism? How soon do people forget the Shoah? But they're out there with their banners, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. How soon they forget. In 3 or 4 instances in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, we are taught, using the language, Hishamer lecha pein tishkach et Adonai Elohecha, or pein tishkach et brit avotecha. Hishamer lecha, take heed and be careful, lest you forget the Lord your God, or lest you forget the covenant of your ancestors. These words were directed by Moses to the 2nd generation of Israelites, the children of those who left Egypt, the children of those who beheld with their own eyes the plagues and the parting of the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, and the giving of the 10 Commandments and the miracles of the desert. Now the next generation comes in, and Moshe says to them, echoing the words of God or channeling the words of God, Hishamer lecha pen tishkach, be careful lest you forget. But people are forgetting right now. So many people are heedless and forgetting. And why are they forgetting? And why are they heedless? Well, I would suggest because of anti-Semitism and because of a poison, a toxin in the human heart that is always looking for an excuse and a chance to stick it to the Jews. However they can stick it to the Jews, they do it, including some among our own people who ally themselves with these very same forces among the protesters. But we will not forget. Zachor velo tishkach. Remember, but do not forget. And that is one of the main themes of Yom HaShoah that is to come. In today's Torah portion, Acharei Mot, we have the very well-known ritual of purification that included 2 goats. One goat was to be sacrificed upon the altar. The other goat was for Azazel to be cast into the desert, and some would suggest thrown over a cliff in the desert. What was that goat called? Seir LaAzazel in Hebrew, but what is it often referred to in modern parlance? Scapegoat. The scapegoat. In other words, the priest would lay his hands upon the head of the goat and therefore transfer the sins of the people to the goat. And then the goat would be sent out to the desert. The original scapegoat. And the scapegoat theme has perversely morphed and changed and devolved. I'm not saying evolved, devolved throughout history to imagine that instead of the sins of people placed on the heads of the Jews as scapegoats, what do we have placed on our heads? We have the unhappiness, the misfortune, the blame that people put on our heads for the troubles of the world. It's all our fault. Whose fault is what's going on in Israel? It's all Israel's fault. It's all our fault. And collectively as Jews, and that is what we are seeing with these demonstrations, not just Israel, but all of us, it's our fault. We are being scapegoated. It happens time and time again. So that's the bad news. But I don't want to focus for the rest of my sermon on the negative, on the bad news. I'd like to turn for a moment to some better news. And that has to do with the Holocaust commemoration service that was held at the First Church in Fairfield just the other evening. And I saw many of you there. And there were hundreds of people there. I have no idea of the total number, but there were hundreds, maybe more, maybe 1,000. I don't know. There were many, many people at this service. And I wanted to highlight for you just a few aspects that gave me hope. And the first was when the pastor, the rector of the church, and her name is Vanessa Rose. Vanessa Rose, when at the very, very beginning of the service, do you remember what she did? She warned everybody. She said, this is not the place for protest. This is not the place to use this opportunity to infuse your toxicity. And this, not her words, but this is what she meant, right? The toxic and poisonous kind of thinking that would blame the Jews and blame Israel right now. And she basically said, that's what you want to do. I'm going to follow you out of here myself.
Yeah. Well, it is a liberal church, so there are voices like that in her church.
I'm sure there are, and she silenced them right in the moment. She silenced them right there. That was number one highlight. Number two highlight was a young woman who is graduating from Fairfield Ludlow. I think they used to call it Roger Ludlow. Yeah. Okay, when I was there, who very bravely and courageously stood up and spoke about incidents of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that she is suffering that she is suffering and she and her cohort are experiencing at Ludlow High School. And she got up there and very courageously spoke about this. That was indeed one of the highlights for me. And finally, the highlight for me at that service was the choir. The choir. And they were a Fairfield County choir, children's choir. It looked like they were age range from maybe 9 or 10 till 17 or 18. Middle school and high school aged children who stood up in front and sang the words of the psalm so beautifully and with such soul and with such passion. At this service, listening to this, it truly gave me hope. It gave me hope. It gave me hope for the Jewish people. It gave me hope for Israel. The children in that choir were not asked, what are your political views? Do you feel comfortable or not comfortable? They all got up there and they sang their hearts out, and they sang so beautifully. And it was hard to sit there without feeling some brimming of emotion, some tears welling up, hearing these young people sing. This was truly inspirational. It was inspirational to me, and I could feel the vibrations of the inspiration of the people sitting around me. And everybody in that room could not help be moved by the voices of these young people. So that's the good news. Aside from all the bad news, aside from all the sorrow, aside from all the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism that we are experiencing in our midst, in our culture, in our country, around us, in spite of the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that we have seen at many of these demonstrations, peaceful as many of them may be, but underlying that peacefulness, underlying that are underpinnings of hatred against Israel, against Jews, against Zionism that we cannot and must not ignore. But then we feel inspired and hope by, God willing, a new generation of people embodied by those young people singing in that choir at this very powerful and moving service that many of us experienced the other night at the church. And we have hope. We have hope for a promising and bright future. We have hope as we pray that someday the world will see the truth and justice of the cause of Zionism and the Jewish people. And we are heartened and strengthened by the words of the prophet Isaiah that are read on the 8th day of our festival of redemption, Pesach, from the 11th chapter of Isaiah, the words with which I will end my remarks today. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid, the calf, the beast of prey, and the fatling together. V'na'ar katon noheg bam, with a little child to lead them, with a little child to lead them. It is time for us to allow a new generation, not those who are spreading poison at these college demonstrations against Israel, but those children who are willing to stand up and sing in a choir at a Yom HaShoah service. Those are the voices that God willing will lead us into a bright future. Amen. Page 155.